Hey guys, we're gonna get started really soon. We're gonna wait for everyone else to show up, so we're going to start at 6:05. Hey guys, we're gonna get started really soon. We're gonna wait for everyone. Yeah, again, for anyone just joining, to give others the opportunity to join as well, we're going to start 6:05 in case anybody's a little bit late. All right, it's about 6:05, so we'll get started. First off, hello everyone, and thanks for coming. This is Balance First number 2, covering an analysis of CenterStage. The format will be roughly 30 to 45 minutes of presentation and then a Q&A afterwards. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in chat. Our speaking team this workshop is my own team, FTC Team 19458, Equilibrium.exe. Last year, 19458 won the Connect Award in their division and were Robot Game finalists in their division as well. I'll hand it over to Miriam and Owen and we'll begin.
Okay, so we're going to be doing a general overview of the whole center stage game and pointing out some of the things about the field and the game and just general aspects new teams and some returning teams should learn about. First, we're going to be starting with a general overview of the stage and field. So some of the general things to look out for is, so as usual, it's the 12 by 12 field, as returning teams will know. And some of the first things we kind of see when we look at the field are three main things. We see these two big backdrops on the end of the field, along with trusses along the middle. And those are going to be our main aspects of this game. So we have these pixels that are on the bottom of the screen, which are the main elements or objectives that we use to score. And these will be given to the robots on the field to then be placed in different places like the backstage and the backdrop. Some of the big things to look out for is we have three stacks, somewhat like power play, that are on the audience side of the field. And this is one place that teams can go and get pixels to then score in either the backstage or on the backdrop. We also have the wings, which are in the corners, which interestingly enough, unlike last year, are opposite of the team. And that's where a human player can also give elements to the robots. Now, one of the biggest things about this year that may be new for some teams that have just maybe started last year is these trusses in the middle of the field. Now, the yellow gate in the middle has a 12-inch area which robots can fit under without touching the gate, but the gate can also be raised to go on to move under if you are a taller robot. The trusses in the middle, which are blue and red, have a clearance of 12 inches, and those are a little bit lower, but if your robot is low enough profile, you can also go under those. Something that's also different this year is that as opposed to the Forio targets, which were placed around the field in past years to help with navigation, there are these new things called the April tags, which are right by the stack and on the backdrop, which teams can also use for things like navigation and localization. The pixels that we have are 3 inches in diameter, and then they have also half an inch in height. And that's kind of a general overview of what the game field looks like this year.
So the scoring this year, there are many tasks, so I'm not going to go over everything, but the main ways to score points is in auto, you can park in the backstage area. You can also, there are actually two randomization tasks this year. So you can choose to have a white pixel as a randomization element, or a team prop. Those, whichever randomization element you choose, they will go on one of the three spike marks directly in front of where your robot starts. If you opt to go for a team prop, both randomization tasks are 20 points each, but if you use a white pixel, they're worth 10 points each. There are two randomization tasks. The first is placing the purple pixel onto the spike mark that your prop or white pixel is on. And you can also place your yellow pixel onto the backdrop. Yes, you are allowed to preload two elements and possess two elements that you can preload a yellow and or purple pixel. And additionally, all pixels that you place in the backstage are 3 points each, and each pixel in the backdrop is 5 points each. Driver controlled, you can continue placing pixels. Mosaics, which you can kind of see in the diagram at the bottom, those are like triangles of pixels, so that are either all the same or all different, and those get you additional points. In addition, there are 3 different lines on the backdrop, and you get 10 points per line that your pixels are touching. In endgame, there are some special tasks, so you can park. You can actually hang from the trusses, and additionally, there you can launch a paper airplane out of the field towards the audience. And the closer you are to the wall, the more points you get.
So as Miriam had mentioned before, in autonomous, there is a scanning or vision task where a white pixel or team prop can be used to indicate which area your pixels should be dropped in. Now, this can be done with either, as I mentioned before, the white pixel, which is the default, or teams can, by their own choice, actually replace it with their own custom prop that they have built. Now, some of these rules for these props are that it must be entirely either blue or red, depending on your alliance, but there is some shading. So that can be used to maybe potentially optimize things like computer vision, or maybe just for choices of just making what looks better. Um, they can actually also be multiple shades of color. They don't have to be one shade of red or blue. They can be multiple different shades. And one of the big differences we'll see this year, as opposed to past games, if any of you guys have participated in those, is that you aren't actually allowed to put any fiducial markers on your team props. So in past years, some teams would use things like April tags or barcodes to use computer vision algorithms to determine which zone the cones were in, but this year that won't be allowed. Some of the sizing rules we have is that the max size is 4 inches by 4 inches by 4 inches, and the minimum size is 3 by 3 by 3 inches. So there's not a ton of room for how big you can make it, but there is a little bit of flexibility depending on what you want to do. Something that's pretty common for pretty much all years is that your team prop can only has to have your team number on it. That's kind of just so the refs can identify whose team prop is whose. Um, it obviously can't be like anything mechanical, can't have any electronics or anything like that. And especially something that it can't resemble any of the scoring elements for this year. So it couldn't be something like a pixel that was just looked exactly like any normal pixel in the field, but just with your team color. That wouldn't be allowed. Miriam also mentioned how in endgame you can score a drone. So the way that works is your team at the beginning of the match can preload like a paper airplane essentially onto their robot. And then in the end game, you can throw it over the trusses into 3 zones on the audience side of the field. Now there are some rules regarding about what this drone can actually look like. So we'll go over those. The drone has to kind of resemble your classic paper airplane. So it has to have wings and a main body, officially defined as a fuselage. The predominant color, similar to the team prop, is that the predominant color of the drone must be the shade of the alliance's color. Though this is different from the actual team prop because it just has to be the predominant color. It doesn't have to be completely one color. But similarly, it can be a shade. It also must have a team number, again, so the refs can identify whose team prop is whose. And something that teams will want to make sure of is that it's made of a single sheet of paper. So you can't do things like add a bunch of piece of paper to add weight or something like that. It can be only one piece of paper. It can't be any larger than 8.5 inches by 11 inches. So your normal standard paper. Anything like adding colors or team numbers, other decorations can be written on with like a pencil or a pen or other markers. But you can't use things like crayons, other things to try to artificially add a little bit of weight just by designing it. So there are some constraints about what you can use to actually design and mark things onto your drone.
So there are a few notable rules in the game manuals this year. So the obvious one is possession limits. You can only control 2 pixels at a time. One thing that's been different for previous years is the period, and as in driver controlled and autonomous, they end at the beginning of the buzzer. So like especially a driver controlled, yes, you have until the end of the buzzer to put your game pads down, but there's no buzzer beater pixel placement because the period has ended by the time the buzzer starts. Hanging and parking are scored at the end of the period instead of at rest, which means that if you're hanging and your robot loses power, you'll still get the points because you're hanging at the end of the period. And then if your robot is on the audience side of the truss, well, actually the audience half of the field, so like it's directly under the truss also, you can't score the pixels. You have to be in the 3 rows of tiles closest to the backdrop in order to score pixels onto the backdrop or backstage. Flexible materials, for example, like zip ties, surgical tubing, stuff like that, are allowed to extend a 1/4 inch outside of the 18-inch cube this year. So, it's just a good wiggle room on the 18-inch limit. So the neutral zone in auto is the tile seam in the center of the field. So if you can't, so if you cross into your opponent's side of the field, and you hit them, you'll get a penalty. But the only zone that is considered neutral that no one will get penalized if there's a collision is the tile seam. So pretty small neutral zone. And then pixels scored in auto are counted again in tally up if they are still in scoring position, and knocking over a stack of pixels in auto or tally up. But I think it's mostly relevant to auto is allowed.
So now we want to talk about some general game insights. So as some of you might have picked up, as I mentioned earlier, there is your line swing is actually opposite of your backstage or backdrop, depending on where you want to score. So what this means is different from other years is teams will essentially be forced to cross the field if they want to receive any pixels from the human player. What this means is that there'll likely be a lot of paths that go across each other. So blue robot will be going to their wing, while the red robot will be going to their ring, and that may create some sort of traffic or collisions around your gate or even under the trusses. So this is something definitely to watch out for. Is there'll be a lot of robots and they'll all be going and crossing paths lots. That's something to be careful of. Something we'll see that some of you who have been participating for a longer period of time may know is that similar to Skystone, there are these trusses in the middle of the field. And that means that, again, you've kind of have two choices. Number one, you can make your robot have enough clearance, that way you can go under them. Or if you don't want to make your robot under 14 inches, you always do have the option of finding a way to lift up the gate. That way your robot can go under the raised gate portion. And some kind of also going back to Skystone is that we have the idea of feeder and placer robots. Now, some of you may not know this, but in another season, older season called Skystone, there was a strategy that arose where teams would have alliance of two robots. They'd have one robot who would generally go to either the human player, or in this game, you could go to the stack or the human player. They would go receive elements and essentially give them to the pass robot, which would then go ahead and score them. Something we may see happen in this year is that some teams will try and have one team go for the pixels and just give them to the other robot, and that robot will do most of the scoring. And another big thing that we might see is that, as Mary mentioned earlier, you can score mosaics by using differently colored pixels. But each team only have 5 of each color. So 5 green, 5 purple, 5 yellow, and then, but white there'll be more of. But for the mosaics, you only have 5 of each color pixels. So you're either limited to the mosaics you can actually form, and you want to be very careful you don't drop them or lose your mosaics.
So these are just some of the robots that we have seen early on in the season. So as you can see, these are just prototypes. Like, most of these are just a robot in 30 hours. It's very early in the season. But a lot of it, like you can kind of see like there are different kinds of intakes. These are just some of the early prototypes. So you can consider like an active intake, want an active intake or a passive intake. Do you want, like, how do you want to place? And then there are also like different hanging mechanisms. Like it looks like in this one, there's a little hook that latches on. Pretty simple mechanism. And then we also have you can see a drone launcher. Yeah, I mean, any thoughts, Owen, on this?
So I think one of the most interesting things about this game, when I first heard about it at least, was the drone. So the idea of the drone is that, again, you launch kind of a paper airplane from the far side of the field all the way towards the audience and actually out of the field, which is pretty different from a lot of other games because you usually didn't launch elements outside of your field. Now, one thing that I think teams will really have to think about is how consistently can you use that drone, because anybody who's thrown a paper airplane before knows it's pretty hard to get a consistent throw in. So doing lots of testing on what kind of drone designs you'll be doing, and also testing of what kind of drone launchers you'll do, I think will become kind of important. Just so you really have to go through lots of iterations and testing to try to get as consistent of a way to score as possible.
Yeah, and I'm looking at questions in chat. So it's just like, what rules would you say are the biggest to look out for this season? So I think a big one, I think I forgot to mention it in my slide, but something that I'm not sure how the refs are going to call it is transit priority. So in the truss, the robots that are going from the audience side to the backdrop have transit priority, meaning that if two rope if like I mean there is space for two robots underneath there, but like there isn't really space for three 18-inch robots. Like let's say there are three robots, two that are going towards the backdrop, two that are and one that's going back towards the audience side. The one going back towards the audience side has to wait and let the two robots going to the backdrops wait wait go through because that's just the rule.
Yeah, so I think that'll
Have the
be
ref.
really interesting because as we talked about before with the crossing paths, there will definitely be a lot of times that two teams are trying to go under that gate. So we'll definitely have to see how that plays out and how that affects people's ideas of their cycle timing and things like that. And just another thing I wanted to add about kind of our early robot concepts and things we've seen in like Robot in 3 days or 30-hour videos is that there's really a lot of different mechanisms that you can use this year, especially since there's kind of three main objectives. You have a lot of different mechanisms that you have to think about, which, unlike power play, where you'd one element and you're pretty much trying to do the same thing the whole game, there's going to be a lot more to think about this year. So it's going to be a much more complicated game, and teams are really going to have to do lots of iterating and designing on what different uh, kind of manipulators or scorers or other type things that they want to build.
I see another question about how we might teams might get penalties. So trying to think of it's not exactly a penalty, but I do worry. I was actually playing around with this earlier today because our field just arrived. But the descoring your scored pixels from the backdrop, it's technically not a penalty, but it is effectively a penalty because you will lose a lot of points from that. It is you don't like it doesn't take like if you can hit it a little, but you just you can't bang on it, or if you have to be really careful driving around the backdrop because you really don't want to knock over your scored pixels. And the same goes like let's say you're trying to play defense, you don't want to push them into their backdrop because that's kind of just forcing them into a penalty, and then they'll descore and then you will get penalties. Yeah, and I see another question. Can we pick up pixels in the backstage to be dropped onto the backdrop? So we are not the GDC, but my understanding from reading the game manual is yes, you should. I don't see why you wouldn't be allowed to descore your own game elements.
And something building a little bit more onto the thing about hitting off the backdrop is if you do have your own off field or backdrop home, we just got our kit actually arrived today, is that what you can do is what I really suggest and recommend doing is just kind of going up to your backdrop, place a few pixels and maybe just tapping with your hand or driving your robot into it and just kind of see how much force it can take because there may be something you have to worry about is making sure your drivers are practiced enough not to go and hit into your backdrop or the other team's backdrop.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a couple of common questions for this game in case it helps anybody in chat. So my first question is, can you have mosaics with 4 pixels so that it's effectively 2 mosaics? Because this is something that our team thought about a lot at like the start of the game. We were wondering if that would be a strategy for this game.
No, that would not be a strategy. So the rules, at least from my read of the rules, I'm pretty sure they specifically say that the scored pixels in the mosaic can't be touching any other pixels, can't be touching any other colored pixels except for the other colored pixels in the mosaic. So they can be touched. So they can only touch those two. So like if you add a fourth pixel to a mosaic, it is no longer a mosaic.
And the question I saw in chat was that can we score white pixels in the autonomous period? So one thing you'll see is actually, as I mentioned before, those stacks on the audience side of the field. While your human player can't actually feed you any pixels during the autonomous period, your robot is allowed to go over to these stacks and collect pixels from there.
Okay. If anybody has any other questions, put them in chat. But there are a couple of other commonly asked questions I'm going to ask here. So second, can you pick up pixels on your opponent's side? Because in a lot of the games, your team has certain pixels and your opponent has certain pixels. But in this game, all the pixels are the same color and there aren't aligned specific pixels.
So my understanding of the rules, and again, I want to emphasize we are not giving official answers, but this is just from my read of the game manual. So I understand that you can't go into your opponent's wing, the area that the human player drops the pixels in. So if the human player places a pixel, no, you can't pick it up. But like the stacks and everything outside of the wing is fair game for any team to pick up. You obviously can't descore their pixels. You basically can't enter any taped off areas with your opponent's color. But other than that, all pixels on the board, on the field are fair game for any robot to score.
And that also means that you can't go into your opponent's backdrop, which is still technically pixel on the floor, but if they are in the opponent's backdrop, you can't descore their pixels.
Okay. Another frequently asked question, what happens if you pick up more than 2 pixels? Because you said you can't do it, but what are the actual penalties on that?
The penalties, I believe, would be you get an immediate minor penalty and then another minor penalty for each 5 seconds that you are until you stop possessing.
So to add on to that, if you have like, let's say 20 pixels in your robot, are you only getting that 5-point penalty or that minor penalty, which is 10 points every 5 seconds, or is it happening for each one of those pixels that you're possessing?
Correct. If you have 20 pixels, you'd be getting 18 minor penalties because you're only allowed to legally be controlling 2.
And adding on to this, I know Miriam said it earlier, talking about controlling in the stack, but for teams that participate in power play, when you move the stack as a whole, from our understanding of the gameplay, that is actually a penalty. But at least from our initial read through of the game manual, knocking coins over or pixels from the stack, I know Miriam mentioned an auto, but in type it should also be allowed though. Again, we give no final answers, but that's at least our understanding of the game rules.
Yes, you can. Okay. I believe you can knock it over. You just can't move it. And you can make small inconsequential movements of the stack of pixels. And moving it off the tape is considered consequential.
Okay. In chat, Civ asked, what is the difference between offensive and defense gameplay and being too aggressive?
So I think one of the big things we'll see is there's generally, and pretty much all games, there's been a big difference between what is considered like too aggressive and penalized gameplay, and then just kind of general, because there is obviously defense that does get played by some teams. Some things I might see, I mean, again, it'll be up to the ref at the end of the day. But what we've seen is, again, as Mary mentioned, there's some traffic rules about who has priority when going through the gate. So that may be something. Obviously, trying to like push a posing a line to robot while they're trying to score is definitely going to be something like while they're scoring, if you try to push them or purposely hit them in a way that's going to try to either stop them from scoring or in a way that intends to damage the robot, that'll definitely be allowed. I mean, Miriam, if you have any other things you want to elaborate on, kind of what would be considered too aggressive.
So yeah, so I mean, like Owen said, that what is aggressive, what is just defensive is at the discretion of the ref. Usually like if you like want or let's say pin a robot, meaning that you basically you trap them between the wall and your robot, or your two or like two robots on an alliance trap one of their opponents between their two robots or something like that. That is easily aggressive. That is like one that's specifically called out in the game manual. Um, yeah, I mean, but really, like a lot of it is just if if you're unsure if something is too aggressive, like don't do it. I mean, you definitely cannot. You can't bump a robot while they are attempting to score. And you also can't go underneath your opponent's trusses. But yeah, I mean, it's really if the ref thinks that you are actively like trying to break their robot or something, you'll probably get penalized.
But just because egregious aggressiveness is disallowed doesn't mean you should expect your robot to not be touched at all. So as Miriam did mention, there is still some defense that will be played no matter what. I mean, not necessarily no matter what, but that is allowed. So you maybe just want to make sure just don't expect your robot to never get touched. So make sure you have measures in or just your robot is sturdy enough that it's not going to fall apart if it's just slightly touched by another robot. That's just something. Always beware. There will be some interaction between your robots, most likely.
So I see a question: how often do replays occur? So replays, I've actually been an FTA at an event. Replays, I've never had to ask for a replay to be played, and I don't particularly want to. Replays for matches are only replayed if it is a traceable technical issue, like usually like with Wi-Fi interference. If it's like your battery got unplugged or your power switch got hit or like your driver hub battery died or something like that, that's team imposed, like it's not going to happen. So I have never seen a replay have to occur for those for Wi-Fi interference reasons, and I personally hope I never do. um yeah.
Cooper, did you have any other
Okay,
questions you were looking to ask?
yeah. Can you hang and shoot a drone at the same time?
Yeah,
uh
so that is actually something that's definitely allowed is you can be on hanging on the trusses, but something you do want to make sure of is you're launching it over the trusses and you're not on the audience side of the field.
yeah, and something to keep in mind is the trusses are, I believe, are technically on the audience half of the field. So you do have to launch it over the truss, and it's kind of ref discretion. Like, if you're on the truss, how are you launching it over the truss?
Okay. To add on to that a little bit, can you hang and park at the same time? Because
Uh,
you've seen a lot of teams in past games use like tape measures and stuff to park from really far distances.
so two things for that. So I have two answers. So one, the first answer is no, the game manual says you can't do that. It specifically says between hanging and parking, you can only get points for one of them. And the other part of it is even if that wasn't a rule, if you try to tape measure parking, your tape measure hits the ground, you technically aren't hanging. I mean, yeah, we all know you are, but by the rules, you aren't hanging because you'd be touching the ground. So then you would just get the parking points and you'd lose your hanging points.
Okay. That's
Uh,
all of the questions I
I
have.
see. I see another question from chat. So how long do you have to be hanging to gain the points? So the answer is you just have, I think I went over this earlier. So you just have to be hanging until the end of the period. So you have to be off the ground the moment the buzzer at the end of the match starts. So as long so you can hang up, you can just, if you lift off the ground in the last second of the match, that's fine as long as you are off the ground before the buzzer starts.
But that does not mean that in the middle of end game you could quickly hang up and then drop down and continue with the rest of your game. It has to still be, you still have to be hanging by the end of the period. You can't just go and hang and then come off whenever. That just won't count for points.
Okay. Another question is what are the highest scoring parts of the game in each in auto, end game, and tele-up? So like an end game, is it like hanging? Is it shooting? And what's the point breakdown for that?
So in auto, well, I'm just going to go by point value here. So the highest value in auto is, so placing your yellow or purple pixel is equal point value if you use a team prop. So yeah, placing the purple pixel on the spike mark is worth 20 points. Placing the yellow pixel on the backdrop in the correct location is also worth 20 points. Both if you use the prop, obviously. Driver controlled, well, the highest point value is mosaics and set lines. Those are 10 points each. And end game, you want to get drone zone 1, which is the zone closest to the perimeter wall.
But something teams should consider is just because something has the highest point value doesn't necessarily mean it's the way to go. So you also have to consider things like difficulty or how many times you think you're going to be able to do it.
Okay. Another question is, do you believe mosaics or set lines to be harder? What's the trade-off between doing them? Is it hard to do both at the same time?
So yes and no. So the things that I notice is, so with mosaics, you do need precision in order to make them, and you also, like, your human player only has 5 of each colored pixel. The set lines, obviously, there are only 3 of them, so 5 mosaics, 3 set lines. And the problem with set lines is that I have noticed that the higher up you stack, the harder it is to to the harder it is to not descore. So it's easier to descore it if you have it stacked higher. So it's just a question of, is your robot, are you better at driving carefully or placing precisely?
And I know Miriam touched on this earlier, but as far as mosaics go, one thing that also has to be considered is if your mosaic is touching anything of the same, any other colored pixels, it doesn't count as mosaic. So what essentially this means is your mosaic has to be either touching nothing or it has to be surrounded completely by white pixels, which is definitely something to consider when thinking about mosaics.
Okay. If anyone has any more questions in chat, put them there. If not, I'll ask a couple more frequently asked questions. So another question I have is, what is the definition of moving the stack? Is there like some room for error, or if the stack shifts at all, you get like penalties? And how many penalties is it?
So the rule is that, I believe, again, I'm just a member of a team that has read the game manual a few times. But I understand that that you that if you just can't move the stack off, you can't move the stack intentionally. You can knock it down intentionally, but you can't move it intentionally, and you also cannot move it completely off the tape. If you move it completely off the tape, well, it will count as controlling all of the pixels in the stack. So if you don't have any pixels, so most likely it'll be three minor penalties. If it's a stack of 5, then you don't have any other pixels in your robot. But but that is actually like, what if you do something intentionally? Like, there are some forum questions that might make sense to ask there once it opens.
Yes, so resources where you can find information on some of these rules. If there's anything you think of later or just we haven't addressed today, is there's two main resources. So there's going to be your game manuals, and that's obviously kind of the official rules that first an FTC puts out. But there's also something called like the FTC forum where you can pose questions that refs and other sort of people will answer for you. So if you need any further clarification or any rules, any questions again that you think of later, those are definitely great places to get answers.
Okay. Another question is, what are the challenges between scoring on the backstage and the backdrop? Because you're scoring from probably the same place. So how does scoring like that differentiate?
So backstage versus backdrop. So backdrop is definitely a harder place to score because you need to actually line it up like with like you need to like line up, you like need like backstage a push bot can do. Backdrop you can't really do with a push bot. Um yeah.
So, I mean, an example of that you can kind of see is on the right side of this slide. As you can see how there's a robot which actually uses linear slides to extend out and place a pixel onto the backdrop. So when you're placing something just onto the backstage, it's simply like on the ground and you don't really have to linearly raise it at all. So there is some ease there that makes it a lot easier. And something else to think about on the backdrop is it may be possible, or something to think about is also when you place a pixel onto the backdrop, the pixel does end up going onto the backdrop is at an angle of 30 degrees. So your pixel is going to need to not be able to like bounce off, and it needs to be in a way that it's going to stay and remain on the backdrop because it could, again, bounce out, or when you place it, you could drop it and it won't actually even land onto the backstage. So those are some things to consider.
Okay. Another question are there any penalties for pushing opposing robots on their side versus your side? Is it the same? How about an auto?
So in auto, all collisions, if there is you can't have any collisions. If there is a collision in auto that is not on the tile seam in the center of the field, it will be the robot who is on the opposing side is going to be penalized. I believe it's a major penalty, but I'll have to double check on that. The in teleop, it doesn't actually matter where the collision happened as long as it is not like in an aligned specific area, which is the wing, trusses, and backstage.
A question I saw in chat was, do you think weight distribution might be an issue? So obviously we're not telling people what to do with their robots or what things they have to consider. But something to do that is the biggest thing I would think of that comes with weight is hanging, right? Because obviously when you're hanging, it means no part of your robot is touching the ground. So whatever mechanism you do use, if you do decide to hang, it's going to need to be able to support your whole entire robot. And that's kind of the main place where weight might become an issue. So that could be achieved by either having a mechanism that can handle more weight or making your robot lighter. That way you don't, that your mechanism doesn't have to hold as much weight.
Okay, cool. Another question, are there any like right of way laws for like going through the center area?
Yes. So there are, I mentioned this earlier, robots that are coming to the front are going from the audience side to the side with the backdrops and backstages have transit priority, meaning that they get priority over and meaning that robots can't block them from going through.
And as some of you who may have watched the kickoff video may know, but for those of you who don't, is the gate that swings that can be pulled upwards in the middle. One thing you cannot do, which would be like aggressive defense, so it's just generally legal, would be holding the gate down. That way, another team isn't able to go under it. So you're not allowed to hold that gate down to prevent another team from being able to make that clearance.
If you block one of the gaps on your opponent's side, like you block one of the passages, does that count as a penalty for blocking?
I believe it does.
I'm pretty sure the answer to that is actually no, because there are like a bunch of other pathways.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like it depends. Like if you're, I guess it really depends. Like if you're blocking both of them, it's definitely a penalty. The one thing to keep in mind is when it comes to hanging in endgame, a height restricted, like once the endgame period starts and the robot is trying to hang, height restricted paths do not count as available paths to get to wherever the robot is trying to go to when it comes to are you blocking the robot. But yes, and like let's say there are robots like that are like, but basically I believe the definition of blocking is like the robot can't get somewhere easily without like going in like a loop or something. And like so like let's say like there's like your partner is occupying the center, you're blocking one of their trusses and their partner is under the other of their trusses, that would be a penalty. The thing to keep in mind, however, is you are not allowed to go under your opponent's trusses. So keep that in mind.
And again, you can always go to the forum if you want further clarification on questions. And something else to think about is that at the end of the day, the refs do make the calls. So there may be a little bit of variability depending on the ref. It really just depends.
Okay. Are there any major points that stand out? Are there any like major differentiators this year that you think there will be? Like for example, in past years, it's been pretty often that auto has been a major differentiator. This year, is it endgame? Is it teleop? What do you guys think it is?
I personally think it's still auto because there are not one but two randomization tasks this year, which is very new, and it's like those are each worth like those are worth. I mean, if you should team prop, those are worth 20 points each. So I really think those will be key. Like I think like teams, all the good teams are going to do that. To be honest.
And
Um,
something to consider when thinking about auto is, as I mentioned in this same game, is that pixels that you place in autonomous, if they are still on the backdrop or backstage at the end of teleop, they will also get counted. Many games like refer to this as double counting, but your pixels will also count in teleop for points.
Okay. And finally, another question is after you place the purple pixel on the line, is it just scored in auto or is that double scored as well?
no, that is not double scored. The reason why is because the reason why it is not double scored is because that is not a task in teleop. So like the pixels that you score on the backdrop are double scored in teleop because that's also a task in teleop. So they receive the teleop points, not another set of the auto points. But there are no points for having the purple pixel there at the end of teleop. So therefore, like you can pick it up and score it, and you won't be losing any points.
Question I saw in chat for human player, how far away are they from the perimeter? So, I mean, as you can see in this image, they are pretty much the human player station where the human player can be is essentially like, I mean, again, I don't know the exact distance, and it may also vary just where the competition is or how it's set up, but it's pretty close essentially. So you will basically be at the perimeter, and that's how you can easily reach and place pixels into your station.
Okay. Does anyone else have any more questions in chat? Otherwise, um, Thank you guys all for coming. The next Balance First will likely be on October 7th from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time with FTC Team 12993 Robo Kings. They were first seed in their world division and Australia winning Alliance Captain and Inspire, and they'll be covering how to optimize your robot next time. Thank you and goodbye. If you guys have anything else, put it in chat.
And also feel free to leave any comments or of any further questions you have. And again, always look to like the official FTC resources if you have any questions about the rules.